Hello and welcome to another episode of the People Powered Solutions podcast. This week, folks, we are mixing things up. And when I say we, I mean me, because I will be flying solo. In the past few years, one of the things I've noticed is not enough companies understand and recognize the value of researching and applying for the different grants and funding opportunities that exist out there. Investing in your workforce development, investing in your team often costs money. What better way to decrease the cost of that investment than by offsetting it with some funding? One of the reasons they don't apply for the funding is because the entire application process is too convoluted and complex, or they think it's too convoluted and complex, so they just would rather not even bother at all. So I thought today I would hop on here and do an episode dedicated to grant writing and how to navigate and research and find funding for your project and or for your employees, to be able to train your employees, to be able to hire new employees, the whole shebang. I offer a grant writing workshop normally, so I thought instead of waiting to attend one of those workshops, I would hop on here, do an episode dedicated to my 5-step grant writing process and giving you further insight on how you as an organization or a company can get started on not only identifying which grants or funding opportunities you might be eligible for, but even go further and take that first step in applying. So this is what our episode's all about. Welcome to the People Powered Solutions podcast. In this show, you'll gain expert advice and tips on building a thriving workplace culture with happy employees. I'm your host, Lorianne Duguay, and I'm thrilled to be spending this time with you today. This is the first time I am sharing a screen during one of my podcast episodes, so I'm pretty excited about just the newness of all of that. But for those who are only tuning in over audio, fear not, everything that is on the slides, they're really just my visual cues to make sure that I talk you through all these steps. So I will be including in the oral presentation as well, so fear not, you're not missing out on anything. I will also, in the show notes, include a copy of my presentation so that you can dive a bit deeper in the event that you really wanted to see what was on the slides. Okay, so let's get this party started. Grants and funding. It seems like such a huge task to start to research that, to start to find out how to apply, how to craft your application, how to craft your funding proposal to really optimize the odds that it will in fact be approved. So we're here today to walk you through every single one of those steps. But before we do so, I think it's really important for us to talk about that first step where you've identified there's a need for funding. Maybe you haven't even spent any time thinking about this. That's okay. At your next leadership team meeting, why not think about where might there be opportunities for us to actively seek out funding to offset the cost of our operations? It might have to do with a special project that you want to put on. There is a ton of innovation funding out there and grants intended for very specific industries. So depending on your industry, make sure that you're searching once we get to the research. We're going to get to that part a little further down the presentation, but make sure that you start by defining what exactly you're looking for support in, because it's what you're going to have to build your entire proposal and or explain in your application if it is a predetermined form from the funding agency. So you need to define your project. What is your project? When I do this workshop normally with organizations, I will help them define that project or we'll come up with a dummy project. But just for the purpose of today, we're going to talk about a festival. Our community is putting on a festival, or our organization. You know what, to make this more entrepreneur-centric, let's flip that. We are thinking about launching a research project that would enable us to eventually tap an entirely different market, but also it would allow us to ship internationally. Let's say that's our project, but we first need to do the research, and unfortunately our research and development budget right now is kind of tight, so we're thinking we might want to seek out some funding for that. So that's our project. This is me in the moment defining a dummy project for the purpose of this podcast episode. Bear with me here as I switch the slides. For those just listening over audio, it just said define your project. So you've missed nothing. I have covered it all. When you are defining your project and clarifying your scope, one of the things that's really helpful to do ahead of time and that essentially will inform where you seek out funding opportunities, is to think about what is our end game? What are the objectives of this project? And if it's just you're looking for training funding, well, the objectives are ultimately to increase the competency and skills of your team members, or perhaps it is to increase your overall organizational competency in reference to a specific software or a specific piece of equipment or a specific technique, a sales technique. You just need to understand what the end game is. So start with the end in mind. You need to define those project objectives, because most proposals and most applications will ask you to say, why are you coming to us? What are the project objectives? So you need to define those early on, so that once you do start to reach out to different organizations and funding agencies and you're getting asked questions, you've already got those answers ready to dish out and to provide to them. Then you need to think about the beneficiaries. Who will benefit from this project? Who ultimately are you trying to help? And if it could be your organization, it can, absolutely. But who is going to benefit? Your employees are going to benefit because suddenly they're going to feel more competent in their role. For example, if we're talking about training, if we're talking about implementing a new software program and understanding how to use it effectively, then the entire organization will benefit. But you know what? So will your external users, because they will get the level of service that they expect. There'll be less delays in service. Just customer service in general will be increased. There's all kinds of ways to spin this, but you do have to think about the beneficiaries of the project. More on this when we start to talk about understanding your funders, but we'll stay tuned for that. So the beneficiaries, the activities. How do you propose going about rolling this project out? If it's a project, if it's training, then what is that training period going to look like? What are some of the steps? And you want to get as granular as possible. You want to include every little detail as possible. If it's research and development, make sure you sit with your team, you sit with those you think are going to be tasked with some of these pieces, and you make a plan to how we're actually going to roll this out. What might that look like? Don't worry, at this point, it's not set in stone. It's just something so the funding agency has the information they need to, on their end, do their assessment. Because let's be honest, they will have very specific guidelines and directives and just eligibility criteria that they need to match. And it's usually a rating system. So the more check boxes you hit, or the higher your rating, the more likely you are to receive and be approved for the funding. Timelines and milestones. You want to make sure that you understand what the timelines of that funding project are, as well as when will you know that you have in fact progressed to that next level. If you've phased it out into 5 phases, what milestones will you have achieved after the first phase, after phase 2, after phase 3, et cetera, so that all this information, when a funder on our end, if I got an application or a proposal come in when I was with government that had all of these details and all of this information, it told me a few things about that applicant. It told me that they did their research. It told me they did their homework and put together this information in order for us to really minimize the burden of assessment, of evaluation, of recommendation. They've also clearly got the capacity to manage and to adhere to the project guidelines, the program guidelines of whatever program is funding that project or that initiative. It just speaks volumes if you come to the funder with all this information ahead of time and prepared. Your KPIs, so what are some of those key performance indicators that you will continuously measure and strive to achieve in order for you to be able to say, yeah, this was actually a very big success, or wow, we missed the mark. Here's what we need to do to adapt, to change. And what's the expected results? So when we say expected results, it ties back to 2 things. It ties back to your project objectives, absolutely. So will we have achieved it? What's our end game? And how will we know we have achieved it? What are those results? But it also ties back to the beneficiaries to say, how will this project have effectively benefited? Let's be as specific and as measurable as possible so that we can really say that it was or was not a success. So that's basically, again, for my listeners, the define your project, clarify your scope. Clarify your scope has all of these different elements, the project objectives. What is it you want to do? Why is it you want to do it? Who is going to benefit? How are you going to do it? And then in what timelines are you going to do it? what are some of the milestones or some of those kind of defining moments where you're going to say, yeah, absolutely. If we've achieved this at this point, we're in great shape to achieve those intended objectives. And then what are some of the metrics or KPIs you're going to measure along the way? And ultimately, what's your end game going to look like? What are those expected results that you hope to achieve once you've brought this entire project to fruition? Fruition's another one I have a bit of trouble with, right? Okay, so that's all under defining your project. Step 2 of our process is research your grant opportunities. So once you have an idea, we need funding for this. We need funding to help with wages, to offset the cost of wages. We need funding maybe for training our leadership team. We've noticed that our leadership team could really use a leveling up in terms of understanding the more people-powered side of things. Of course, I've got to plug that because I feel that a lot of leadership development programs are very technical, but where I see a lack in throughout all industries is more in terms of understanding those more people-centric concepts of managing courageous conversations, of conflict management and resolution, of strategic communications, etc., etc. So I'm going to use that as an example, of course, because that's our specialty and that's our jam. So maybe you want to provide training for that. Maybe you've got a group of fairly junior technical folks that you think would benefit from very structured training that cannot be provided in-house, but you're able to source a few different agencies or institutions or associations that would be able to provide that more targeted, specific training. And that's what the project's about. Maybe you're not an entrepreneur. I'm going to step outside that entrepreneurial box here. Maybe you're a municipality or a community and you're putting on a festival of sorts. Awesome. We're putting on a festival. We're actually going to use that example for how to structure your research. So where to look, the starting point is the same point as everywhere. Dr. Google, just go to the website, do your research, use some keywords. You really have to think about some of those keywords and your objectives and what you're ultimately wanting to do and your end game are what are going to inform some of the keywords. So you're either going to go training funding or tourism funding because festivals attract tourism, right? Or you'll think about things like research and development funding to our earlier example, research and development funding for private sector. Get as specific as you can. Start broad, but then as you're starting to find different places, get as specific as you can. Make sure that you are checking the eligibility criteria as you're looking through the websites once you've landed on different opportunities, but more on that when we get into the what to take into consideration. Let's just continue with where to look. Another place to look is different associations. So for example, there is the EMC, the Excellence in Manufacturing Consortium. They have funding that is dedicated to them as an organization. They're also often experts in helping point you in the right direction. If you are in manufacturing, for example, and you need to access different funding, just the funding you'll be able, and the grants that they'll be able to facilitate you getting is worth whatever membership they're charging for that year. So check out the different associations. There's Canadian, I'm in Canada, of course, so the Canadian Tooling and Machining Association. There are mining associations. You know, there are tons and tons and tons of different associations, basically regulatory bodies who are tasked with oversight of different industries or different professions. Tap into them, check out their websites, see what kind of funding opportunities might be available through them. Check it out. Newsletters, you want to subscribe to various newsletters, especially of different funding agencies, be it federal, provincial, statewide or countrywide, federal. Just you want to sign up for their newsletters because it is often in those newsletters that funding initiatives are revealed. They're announced and launched using these types of communications. Finally, networking events. When there's a BNI or if there is, I know there's AIM in the US as well, any entrepreneurial or any network that provides support to an entire cohort of the population would normally also be aware and would be able to point you in the right direction when it comes to funding within that industry. So definitely make sure that you do attend. In my early career, as I said, I was on the approval end of some of these different grant programs. And one of the things we created up here in Northern Ontario is a funder forums. So these funder forums were like one-stop shop. And I know I've seen variations of them both in the public and the private industry, but they're a one-stop shop for all different funding agencies or funding bodies to show up, and they have tables and booths, and you can walk around and they'll give you more insight in terms of what kind of funding they would have to offer. The funding forums were a great opportunity to really very briefly elevator pitch your project so that the people who are there representing whatever that funding agency are able to provide you further insight in how they might be able to help. The second thing that we had created was, and I think that was a bit of a unique situation, but I'm sure there are parallels out there. It's just to do the research to find them. We had a committee of different funding agencies throughout our area. And instead of someone who, for example, this community who wants to put on a festival, having to go to each of these funders individually, they could come to one of our monthly meetings and they could message us to get on the roster of the agenda, and then they would present their idea to us. I've seen parallels in some of those angel funding communities, those investors. It's you pitch your idea and then suddenly you're able to, in one-stop shop, get a ton of insight in terms of how each funding agency might be able to help you. So here's a perfect example. Community was doing a festival for real. This is a true story. And they came to that same committee to present one time. They explained what the festival was and how it would benefit the community as a whole. I, at the time, was working for a federal entity that was tasked and mandated to support unemployed and displaced workers trying to reintegrate into the labor market. At the table, we also had someone from the Ministry of Tourism, who of course is responsible for attracting tourism to the various communities throughout the area. And they're very invested in increasing tourism in all of the communities they serve. Also at the table, we had two different funding agencies. One was specialized in small businesses and supporting small businesses with all their business needs, while the other was responsible for just economic development in general throughout the entire region. So they were tasked with really supporting all entrepreneurs of all different scope and sizes in excelling within their area, but also in attracting that next economic development opportunity to the communities. So all these people are at the table. The community comes and sells their festival, explains their idea. Then one by one, we explain. So the tourism folks are talking about how when they prepare the application, there would be funding available to help fund, for example, the creation of all the pamphlets, as well as all of the social media campaign that would be built around attracting and marketing that festival to others throughout the area. Perfect. Then on to me, where I would say, well, I could provide labor and potentially some costs to help build temporary structures like stages and little shelters that could be sprawled out throughout the area. We could help for the cost of wood, but also we could fund the people responsible for building these structures, as well as a coordinator maybe for the entire event to help really pull this all together, because I'm mandated to support our clients in either maintaining their skill set while they wait for that next opportunity in the labor market to arise, or in gaining new skills and new competencies that will actually enable them to then find work because they've got that added experience. So definitely once they were done with us, the person next to me who was specialist in, and they were mandated as an organization to support small businesses, was able to say that they have a community funding opportunity where they can get a one-time $5,000 grant to help support community events and bring more business to the small businesses. Perfect. The one next to them, who were tasked with economic development, were able to say that they might have some capital funding available to help fund just the entire cost of the event. And that might be something that would be beneficial. Had there been someone at the table that perhaps was specialized in music and they were mandated to support culture within the province or within on a federal level, they may have said that if it's a music festival, we have funding available to bring in artists. So all that to say, they went to this one meeting and were able to garner insight from all of these different funding agencies in terms of how they might be able to access funding and what they might want to include in their application if and when they moved forward with applying for the different grants or funding opportunities. So just make sure that you're putting yourself out there, that you're sending people to attend some of these events, because it's at these events that you're able to get the most bang for your buck, in that you're able to speak to the most agencies and funding bodies that will be able to give you the information you need to be strategic in your application process. So definitely here are the different places to look. Next, how to tailor your search. Keywords. You want to make sure that you are really, really drilling down some of the objectives of your project and figuring out if it's training funding you're looking for, if you need funding to offset the cost of a major project, if it's capital funding, if it's you need to renovate your building is breaking apart, your budget does not allow you to renovate, it might be putting your employees at risk, health and safety wise, you really want to invest in this. Whatever the case may be, use some of those more compelling words within that narrative to inform your search. If you're asking one of your employees to do this search on your behalf, no problem. Just make sure that they continue to search and that in their search, they're documenting their findings. Maybe you want to prepare a little checklist, which speaks to that gray column right next to how I'm talking about how to tailor your search, which is the middle column for those only listening. The gray column speaks to what are some of the things taken into consideration. We'll get to that. Maybe you want to prep that checklist so that whoever's doing the research on your behalf, whoever you're tasking with this, knows what they're looking for and they're able to really be targeted in their search. Once they maybe even leveraged AI, right? ChatGPT did not exist back in the day when many of these organizations were seeking out funding. Everything's on the internet now. There is amazing AI platforms out there that will really streamline this research piece. So leverage that power of AI and use it to help you either hone in on what are the best keywords to use when seeking out funding opportunities, and or actually doing the research for you to find these different agencies, what funding or what trading subsidies might be available in the province of Ontario or in the state of Texas. Just make sure that you're being as specific as possible so that you're really going to land and find that funding opportunity that is a perfect fit for you. Next, what to take into consideration, that famous checklist I referred to a few minutes ago. It is, you want to make sure that you're only applying to those funds, those funding opportunities, those grants that you would in fact be eligible for. You'll notice some of them will have an eligibility criteria where if you have 400 employees or less, you're eligible. If you have 401 employees, you're not eligible. So the eligibility criteria, the program objectives or the funding objectives, who they're wanting to help, that's all out there. It's all on the internet. Do your research. Check out their website. Who are they trying to help? Why was this project or program established in the first place? Are they trying to support those individuals who are a visible minority perhaps, or perhaps organizations who have recently been impacted by a downturn in a very specific industry, or maybe they want to support innovation in another specific industry. Make sure you're tuning in and checking out all of those different nuances so that you can craft a really powerful proposal when you get to that application point. Make sure you're also paying attention to the deadlines, because a lot of these funding programs will only accept applications certain periods of the year. So pay attention to that. Make sure that it is in fact an open period and that they are accepting deadlines. All little things to keep into consideration as you're doing your research. So once you have done your research and you are ready to start your application, you want to start by connecting with someone who works at that funding agency. You want to contact someone. I know you're thinking, I got this. All the information is right there online. Really don't need to speak to someone. But in fact, you do. Because once you contact someone via email or over the phone, what you're doing is you're putting yourself and your organization on their radar. It's your opportunity to do this micro pitch of the project, this micro pitch of your organization to start to plant that seed of investment of why they should invest in you, if that makes any sense. You want to connect with them, but of course, if you are reaching out for a question and if you've strategically figured out a question you could be asking them, or maybe you just want to vet that you are in fact eligible for that grant, which is often a really easy way to get one foot in the door and to get yourself on their radar, that there's this little exception that you want to make sure that you would still be eligible. It's how you start to have them see who you are, right? But make sure you're only asking things that aren't already answered in the guidelines on the internet, so they're not just pointing you right back to the internet. And it shows that you've done your research and that you're invested in this program and in this funding and the project that you're planning on pursuing. So step 3 is to connect. Now you're ready to start crafting your proposal, your application. So whoever you enlist to craft this, you might, depending on how big the grant or the subsidy is, you might have to think about enlisting some subject matter experts relevant to the actual project. So seriously, if we're talking about a research and development project, you definitely need to bring in those technical experts who are going to provide the insight as to what's the pain point that's led you to the development of this project and why you're pursuing it in order to alleviate that pain point, and how that pain point is likely a pain point that the funding organization is familiar with and that they've seen with others, and that your research or your innovation will in fact help improve on that on a global scale. So it's all on how you sell your salad, if you will, how you craft your story. And when it comes to these grant proposals, even if it's the same project, as I mentioned early on, you need to learn to sell it and pitch it different ways depending on who that funding body is. Let's go back to our festival example. If I was putting on that community festival and I was applying to the tourism funder, that I would make sure that I'm crafting, when I'm talking about my organization, because that's the first thing that you're going to want to gather to provide in your proposal or your application. You want to tell the story of your organization, your company, and how in the past you have supported and invested in tourism. You also want to talk to them how you believe that tourism is key for growing the economy of your region or your industry. You really want to include descriptors in there that shows how invested you are in the same concept or mandate that they have been tasked with in the first place. You start with their mandate, you start with their vision, mission, and values, and you craft your story from your perspective relevant to theirs. That makes any sense. So if I was crafting that same, let's go to that second point under contents. First point was context, organization. Tell your story. Why is it you're here? Who are you as a company? Talk about your purpose, your impact, your mission, your vision, your values. Again, all relevant to the funding body's values as well. But then the second part of that content is who's going to benefit from this project. And so when I'm talking to the organization that funds tourism, I'm going to talk about how it's going to increase tourism in the area and it's going to attract more tourists to the area, which in fact will increase revenue for all of the different companies and businesses within that area. If I'm talking to the funder who supports and is mandated to support displaced workers and help reskill workers to help them transition back into employment, then I'm going to say that the beneficiaries of this project are participants who will have not only maintained their skill set, they will have gained additional skills which will make them more marketable to the labor market and increase the likelihood that they will be able to successfully transition into or back into employment. Because I know that's who they are mandated to serve. If I'm talking about the beneficiaries of my project, when it comes to small business, the small business company, then I'm going to make sure that I talk about how this is going to benefit small businesses. Starting to see this pattern? You really need to craft your story relevant to who that funding body was established to serve. And then for the program itself, why was that program even designed or built or released? It was designed to help some specific cohort of the population find out and craft your story relevant to that cohort. So description of activities, you just want to be as specific as possible on the how. Again, you're not locked in. And if you do describe it in a certain way, doesn't mean that if there's deviations once you start to run the project, that they won't be allowed. They will definitely be allowed. They just want to know that you know and you have a plan how you're going to approach this project. You'll want to talk about proposed timelines. Again, this is why at the onset I talked about when you're defining your project, you need to be thinking about all these things because they're going to be asking about all these things. Are there any partnerships, especially if you're a nonprofit? You want to leverage partnerships and make sure that you show how this project is going to be benefiting more than one entity, more than one organization, that you've brought in all these partners and made this a true collaboration that will benefit several organizations. Because on the receiving end, as I'm looking at rating and approving these, especially if we are mandated to nonprofits, we want to have the biggest impact possible. We have limited funding as a funding agency. We want to make sure, and by say we is when I used to be at that approval level, just to be very clear here, we want to make sure that our funding is going to the most deserving and to those who fit the program objectives the most and to those who fit our organizational mandate the most. So make sure that you're crafting a story, and if partnerships are part of that story to increase your odds, then you go out there and you forge some very valuable partnerships. If it's your private sector and this is a grant, a capital grant or whatnot, no, there's nothing wrong with going in joint venture and partnering with other organizations who could benefit from it to increase your odds of receiving the funding. Again, milestones, expected results, and making sure that you talk about how you're going to measure the success of this project, how you've already lent some thought about to what a successful outcome would look like. And you're already prepared to continuously measure your progress towards that picture. Finally, reporting. You want to talk about how you plan on reporting back to them and keeping them apprised of the funding and the project progress, but also how the funding is being spent, and that you're accountable to really making sure you adhere to all of their requirements when it comes to reporting. So that's all of the things that you're likely going to have to include in your proposal. It sounds super overwhelming, folks, but if you've done a good job at defining your project at the onset, if you've done the research to figure out what the organization is about, and who they want to help and what that funding program was intended to support, then this part actually is quite effortless. Just make sure that you're providing as much information as possible without going overboard, because nothing in the world drove me more mad than when I got an application, a proposal that was 45 pages long for a project that could have easily been defined in 5 pages. So make sure you're only including the information that is relevant and that will enable them to make an informed decision, but that you're including as much detail as possible in order for them to make that call. Okay, switching it up here. Again, just when you are crafting that proposal, making sure that you are in fact covering the who, what, where of it all, and that you're spending time thinking about these things and thinking about the project itself and how you're actually going to implement it. Because it's one thing to apply for the funding, but once you get the funding, guess what? You actually have to deliver on it. And you are going to be signing some legal binding agreements, which sounds more serious. They are serious, but it's totally doable and easy to administer. On that note, make sure you think about the bang for the buck. In my work with clients, we've found some grants for the level of bureaucracy and paperwork and reporting involved for the little amount of funding. It just makes no sense. So just be strategic in that. Do your research, get your team aggressively looking at what are some of the reporting requirements of the programs, how are we expected to report back. For example, there's an amazing co-op funding program out there that if you're hiring co-ops from a post-secondary level or any work integrated learning, essentially, you can get up to $7,000 to help offset the cost of that term placement. So for 4 months, you get $7,000 back. It is effortless to access. As long as they meet the requirements, there's a bit of paperwork at the onset, paperwork at the end. That's it. You're done. One and done for up to $7,000. It's between 5 and 7, depending on who you're hiring. But seriously, folks, that's nothing. And I've helped more than one organization access that funding. And what's beautiful is once they establish the relationship, they're able to keep applying and forecast next term's co-op students and then apply for funding for next terms. And this happens 3 times a year, for the fall, for the winter, as well as the summer terms. And suddenly you've created this source of revenue that you would never even thought about, that can be well into the upwards of 500,000 depending per year, depending on what level and how many co-ops you're able to support within your organization on an annual basis. So definitely spend some time thinking about what this project is, who you want to help, how you're going to go about doing it. And then in your proposal, make sure you're answering the following questions. Why do we need this funding? Who will benefit? What will we do if we don't get this funding? Because that speaks to the urgency. And if it's between applicant A, who, if they don't get the funding, then they're just going to go ahead and proceed with the project and fund it themselves, or applicant B, who, in the absence of this funding, they cannot proceed with that project, we're mandated as an organization, most funding agencies, to support applicant B. How will this project contribute to an increase in our organizational capacity? How do we have and do we have the ability to manage this scale of a project? And when I speak manage, it's the logistics of some of those larger capital grant programs do require quite a bit of reporting and tracking, but seriously, you can get into the millions of dollars for them, so it's worth it. But make sure you've got the capacity to manage both the financial and the reporting side, as well as just the actual operational side of the project. Last but not least, make sure that you highlight how you're going to measure the success of the project and show them that you're able to not only identify what success looks like, but that you have worked in some very specific milestones along the way to ensure that you are in fact meeting them. And if you're not, that you're reporting that back along with a rationale of why you're not meeting them and a mitigation plan on how you're going to ensure that you're still kept more or less on track towards bringing that entire project to fruition. So now, I would love to end this session by going on to, in this episode, talking about tips and best practices when it comes to crafting the actual application before we get to that final step of submitting the application. So again, ensure that you are customizing and tailoring. I can't reiterate this enough, and I know that I've said it a ton of times, but just please, please, please ensure that you are being very mindful of who you're applying to, why they were established in the first place, who they want to help, that program, as well as that funding agency. So make sure that you do customize and tailor every piece of that submission. Even if it's for the same project, it's customized 7 different ways if you're applying to 7 different funders who have 7 different mandates, right? Don't be afraid to connect, clarify, and ask your questions. That's how they connect with you. That's how they become invested and see how invested you are in bringing that project to fruition. Demonstrate your need for funding. As I mentioned, it's about being able to get the most bang for a buck as a funding agency. We are mandated to support the organization or the company who has demonstrated the highest level of need. Define how your project meets funding objectives and that specific program objectives, the vision, the mission. When possible, do provide supporting evidence. If you've said that you've identified this need or this niche that remains untapped and that your project is going to enable you to address that gap in the market or that gap of service or that gap of research, well, definitely if you've got some proof, you've got some data that will support and some metrics that support that, submit it with your proposal. It is absolutely okay to do so. It just strengthens the proposal itself and the project. Demonstrate your capacity to administer that by showcasing the experience, how you have administered parallel projects in the past and why you have excelled at administering such projects in the past, how you guys have the capacity as a company, as an organization to deliver this and implement this project from end to end. Be as concise as possible. As I mentioned earlier, nobody wants a 40-page proposal. Just include the information, all of the little check marks that are in the project objectives. To be honest, those are your guideline for when you're applying for a job and you're looking at the job description and you're making sure that your resume hits all of those points. Same thing with project applications, with program applications for funding. You're looking at the funding program objectives and you're going through each objective and making sure that your proposal has addressed all of the above. And finally, talk about how, especially if it's a one-time funding type program where they say it's a one and done, make sure you define how you're going to sustain whatever state, that future state moving forward in the absence of that funding. If it's not a one and done funding, that's fine, but still explain how that funding will enable you in that project to get to a point where you can then focus on A, B, C, D, which in fact will continue to evolve you as an organization or to evolve the industry, et cetera, et cetera. So really tips and tricks. But the final step in this entire process, folks, you guessed it, it's actually submitting it. So then you submit it to the funding agency. You want to look for that confirmation that it has been submitted before even hitting send or submit. Make sure you proofread it. And even if you think you've proofread it, if you can put it in front of someone else's eyes to make sure that you haven't missed anything, I say 2 perspectives, 2 heads are better than one. It'll just help increase the likelihood that it is in fact almost flawless. Ensure that it has addressed all of the guidelines, all of the objectives, the priorities. Ask yourself, why should they choose us? Have we pitched to convey that? So make sure that you reread it, and as you're rereading, this is why this program was established. Now that I reread my proposal or my application, does it convey why they should choose us? If not, edit before pressing submit. And really define how you differentiate yourself from all the other applicants that will likely be on that desk or within that inbox. And once you're satisfied with all of the above, press submit. Know that they might flip it back to you because it might not necessarily meet all of the program objectives or some parts weren't clear. If they come back to you and ask you to add additional information, that's a good sign. It means that you're on their radar and they really want to help you understand the objectives, the eligibility criteria, and they want more information in order for them to be well set to do that assessment. Well, folks, this was it. I know it was a lot of information. I will include the PowerPoint in the show notes just as a complete gift to all our listeners. But I thought I would do an episode on grant writing because it is one that is very challenging, but I think some people might see it as more challenging than it needs to be. And once you've got a methodology, and this 5-step methodology does really include a lot of information for you to suddenly take on that otherwise daunting task a little more voluntarily, and will help you have some roadmap to follow as you start to, number 1, define your project. Number 2, you start to do your research to find what might be out there, that you connect with someone and you get additional information to make sure that you're crafting a proposal that meets all of their requirements and that it's almost impossible for them to say no to you. Number 4, that you're then really completing that proposal and crafting it and bringing in all the subject matter experts required to really make a strong proposal. You're including supporting evidence if need be. You're submitting and you are successful. Thanks for listening. Now get out there and find a project so you can seek out funding. Well, folks, thanks for joining us for yet another enriching conversation. To hear more about today's guests, make sure to check out the links in the description of this episode. Want to continue the conversation? Then head on over to our social media platforms, all of which are also linked in the description, to keep it going. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss another valuable episode.